You're watching Newsfeed. Let's continue the focus on the Johannesburg inner city building, that tragedy which killed 74 people, injuring many other people. That residential building was gutted by an inferno in Marshalltown, Johannesburg. That comes into sharp focus yet again following the devastating fire which killed over 70 people. A number of questions now have to be asked about what happens next. And let's speak now to African Diaspora Network CEO, Dr. Vusi Sibanda, who speaks to us not too far from the building which was gutted by fire. You were telling me earlier, Dr. Sibanda, good morning to you and thank you for your time. Let's begin with what happens when people who possibly are of foreign origin in South Africa, when they die. Just talk to us about the process that families have to go through in order to repatriate their bodies, because that is quite a process, I understand.
Good morning and good morning to the listeners. Well, yes, indeed, that is a very, cumbersome kind of a process because first, the family must prove that, the person or the remains of the person that has passed on, are of a person that comes from the country where they want to repatriate them, to such an extent that in the majority of the cases, if the person did not have, some documentation, they would have to request for documents from their country of origin, a birth certificate or identification, which will then be taken to the Department of Home Affairs and finally, their embassy, so that repatriation documents are obviously prepared. But obviously, in this kind of a situation, I think the biggest challenge that we have is we have a lot of people that were banned beyond recognition. And now, in order to identify, that person, so it requires that, there is some DNA information that can be used. But that, I think, is a problem because that information is not there. And the issue would be of the 74 people that perished in that building, how many can, be identified to show that, who is this so that they can be repatriated? And I think that's where the big question is.
And it is early days, Dr. Sibanda, but I've got to put the question to you anyway. Are you aware from perhaps people that may have started approaching your organization needing help as to how many foreign nationals may have perished at that building last night?
Well, we cannot run away. The fact is that the majority of the people that perished in that building, from the information that we have so far and the people that we spoke to yesterday, are people of foreign origin. Of that was really, gutted, that had also lost members, in that particular place. But we are very aware and alive to the fact that a very huge number, it could be maybe about 80 to 90% of the people that perished there are people that are of foreign origin.
And I have a reference point, and it was the Germiston tragedy, the gas inhalation tragedy that occurred in Germiston. I remember distinctly people worried about whether or not they were going to have enough money to repatriate their loved ones, because immediately what happens is that people will want to bury their loved ones in their country of origin, and there has to be taxis that are hired in order to move the remains. That particular process, are you able to enlighten us as to what is involved there and whether, anyone who may be willing to help in this regard, who to contact, for example?
Well, literally, I think the issue is true. That process is a lot of families end up just sending, maybe the body, and those that have got motor vehicles, they might actually even hire, some form of a trailer to pull, the remains of the person back home, depending on the accessibility, of course, of the country, because if you're looking at countries that are far, up, like, in Cameroon, Nigeria, it might be a bit more difficult. But countries like Zimbabwe, they will ordinarily, if the person did not have, a funeral policy, they'll just, get, a taxi, like you said, or motor vehicle or buggy and pull, the trailer with those remains. And because now you're looking at the cost of ordinarily, pulling a trailer and hiring, a tech. And a lot of those people do not have that kind of money, in order to do that. So it is a very, huge challenge. But I think we need to be mindful of one thing in this particular case, Tolly, and that being the fact that, we understand that a lot of those bodies were banned beyond recognition. And that is where we need to start from. Because if, they are banned beyond recognition, it means no one is going to be able, in the bulk of those cases where people are banned beyond recognition, to identify who that person is. Because there is no form of identification, there is no form of, DNA information or anything that can then be used. But except, of course, family members that are still alive, who can then say, well, they can take, maybe samples from them so that they can test against, those charred bodies. That could also then assist, and that could take, maybe a bit of a while until, maybe there is some form of isolation, of the bodies. But the process is very expensive, and, embassies are likely to come through. I had the embassy of Zimbabwe because there were quite a number of Zimbabweans and a lot of Malawians as well that I saw there yesterday that might be coming forward to try and assist. But as it stands right now, I think it's a very big problem there.
Yeah. Dr. Sibanda, one topic that cannot be divorced from this conversation, otherwise we might as well not have an authentic conversation. It is that of migration into South Africa's major cities like Johannesburg. A number of the people, as you say, possibly 80-90% of the victims of that fire, they come from neighboring countries to South Africa. When something like this happens, what do you think it says to people who may wish to come to Johannesburg now, having been exposed to exactly the conditions? Just this morning, my colleague Ayanda Nyati was in one of the buildings, which is not too far from the building which burnt down. And the scenes, people sleeping on the floor. And those visuals are actually playing right now as I talk to you. That is desperation at its worst. And you then have the so-called cartels that are running these hijacked buildings who are exploiting the very same desperate people. People have to pay rents upwards of 1,500, 1,600, and yet you are sleeping rough, as we are showing the viewer right now. What do you think that kind of image does to a person who says, I want to go to South Africa because I believe that I could help put food on the table for my family?
Well, I think the biggest challenge that we have, is that a lot of these people, they come from countries where they've not had a meal, for quite an elongated period of time. And you will agree with me, Koli, that if you are in a position where you know that a lot of people have trekked down to a particular country and at least they are able to make a living, even if they live under squalid conditions, they would say, look, maybe I'm going to be an exception. Maybe I'm going to be able to make it, because they see some of their families and friends who come back and they appear to be looking a bit decent. They might live in conditions, but they come, in some cases when they that we're talking to that wish to come, they have nothing to wear, they have nothing to show for. So unfortunately, all these difficulties, they have always been there, Koli. And what you are saying is, it's not a joke. Yesterday, some of the people that, are speaking to, one of the ladies is a South African lady that works with the migrant community, who was also confessing to me to say, look, that building there, where we are living, the doors the gate is always, and sometimes even during load shedding, we've got to wait for 30 to 40 minutes, for the security to come and unlock, that gate, to go out. And you can imagine if there's a fire, because one of the things that happened in the building is that, there were locked gates where people could not, pass through when there was a fire. So the majority of the buildings are a health hazard, even those that are properly managed by, some form of, housing agents and something like that. I think compliance, as far as, checking on these houses to see if, they are complying with safety regulations, is not really being done. But the truth of the matter is, somebody sitting out there who sees this story, who is in a situation that is like what we see now, in desperate countries like Zimbabwe, with the current elections and the current problems that we have. I mean, countries that we see, no peace, the majority of the countries that surround South Africa, maybe with the exception of Namibia, Botswana rather, and maybe Zambia is getting a lot better. But the conditions in those countries, the violence, political violence, and the murders and the threats, coming from those leaders, do not leave people with a choice. It's very sad.
Before I lose you, because of the patchy connection that we have, you raise a very critical question, and that politics also cannot be divorced from this conversation. We've just had an election in Zimbabwe. There's a dispute. That election is disputed. Here is the South African government already putting out congratulatory messages to President-elect Emmerson Mnangagwa. Is that the kind of thing that President Ramaphosa's government should be doing, or should they rather be paying attention to the dispute? Because if that dispute is not resolved anytime soon, there's no telling what could happen next. And therefore, you may see people running into South Africa in large numbers yet again. All I'm simply asking you here, Dr. Sibanda, is there complicity on the part of the South African government when an election has been held and a result is disputed, but here they are, sending out congratulatory messages?
I mean, this is very sad, because remember, we've always said that South Africa is a giant, in the Southern Africa, and it should have a big voice, particularly because of the number of migrants and politics in these countries. Now, South Africa, when SADC, a body that, South Africa is part of, immediately, there are such elections and they are the ones to run and congratulate when they know the problem of Zimbabweans in South Africa. We're sitting on 178,000, ZEP holders that are not holding those ZEP, permits, which means you're looking to close to maybe, 1 million people that are supposed to go back to Zimbabwe if the ZEP conundrum is not resolved in favor of the Zimbabweans. Now, in the face of that, then we have got the disputed elections and another 5 years to ZPF, and ANC simply jumps in and congratulates that because they are all liberation movements and, they are sister parties. They've been working together. They don't care about the people of Zimbabwe. ANC doesn't care about the people of Zimbabwe. It cares about ZANU-PF as a political party because they just want to protect each other. And ANC is likely to face the same kind of wrath in the
All right. Okay, all right. I think as predicted, unable to conclude that conversation, but I think the message is clear from Dr. Vusi Sibanda.